Thanks, Warren. Good morning to everybody or this afternoon. I'd like to introduce our speaker, who's Ely Ratner. Dr. Ratner is a principal at the Marathon Institute Initiative, a bipartisan think tank dedicated to preparing the United States for an era of sustained great power competition. He served as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs. Prior to confirmation, he served as the Director of the China Task Force and as Senior Advisor to China to the Secretary of Defense. Before arriving at the Department of Defense, Dr. Ratner was an Executive Vice President and Director of Studies at the Center for a New American Security, the CNAS, where he was a member of the executive team and responsible for managing the center's research agenda and staff. He served from 2015 to 2017 as the Deputy National Security Advisor to Vice President Joe Biden, and from 2011 to 2012 in the offices of Chinese and Mongolian Affairs at the State Department. He also previously worked in the U.S. Senate as a professional staff member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and in the office of Senator Joe Biden. Outside of government, Dr. Ratner has worked as a senior fellow for China Studies, the Council on Foreign Affairs, a senior fellow and deputy director of the Asia-Pacific Security Program of CNAS, and as an associate political scientist at the RAND Corporation. He received his BA from Princeton University School of Public and International Affairs and a PhD in political science from the University of California, Berkeley. Dr. Ratner, we welcome you and look forward to your talk today. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Lynn, for the introduction, and thank you all for coming out today. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. It's a real privilege, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. So today, I'm going to be talking about something that I believe should really be at the center of American strategic thinking, namely the China challenge and our defense strategy in the Indo-Pacific, what we've built, why we've built it, and what's happening to it right now. I'm going to organize this in three parts. First, talk a little bit about the nature of the China challenge, what we're actually dealing with from a defense and national security perspective. Second, some of the elements of the strategy that we've been building to meet that challenge, the capabilities, the force posture in the region, our alliances and partnerships. And third, where we stand right now, which is candidly a bit of a more complicated picture than I'd like it to be. So I'll just start with a fundamental proposition, which is that the People's Republic of China represents the most consequential strategic challenge the United States has faced, at least since the Soviet Union. And in some respects, as it relates to economics, technology, the speed of China's military modernization, it's actually a harder problem than we faced from the Soviet Union. When we think about threat in the defense community, which is my most recent job at the Pentagon, and my talk today will be very defense oriented. Obviously, the China policy issue is much broader than that. We can talk about that if folks are interested. But from the defense perspective, we tend to look at two things. We look at the capability and the intent of potential rivals. And on both accounts, the picture with China is pretty stark right now. On the capability front, China now operates the world's largest navy by ship count. It has credible forces that can deny the United States military from accessing certain parts of the Western Pacific in a crisis. It has a huge missile arsenal that can range every U.S. base in the region. And its nuclear arsenal is expanding at a pace that we haven't seen from any country since the Cold War, with the Pentagon now projecting China aiming to build up to 1,500 warheads by 2035, which would put it in rough parity, on the way to rough parity with the United States and Russia. And then, of course, China's space and cyber capabilities are also world-class and only getting better. So that's on the capability side. On the question of will, on intent, this is where it's worth being precise because Xi Jinping, China's president, the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, has made the quote unquote rejuvenation of the Chinese nation as the organizing principle of his rule. And it's not an abstract concept. It has very concrete outcomes that he's aiming for, including absorbing Taiwan, establishing military primacy in the Western Pacific, displacing the United States as the leading power in Asia, and revising the regional order where it constrains China's ambitions. And these just aren't projections from the United States. These are, by and large, stated objectives from the Chinese Communist Party. It's also worth emphasizing that we haven't seen change in this strategic direction from Beijing over the last few decades. Not after COVID, not after China's economic slowdown, not after its property crisis, not since Donald Trump has come into office. The military modernization has continued. The coercion against Taiwan has continued. The pressure operations, the air and naval incursions. The militarization of the South China Sea has continued. The military buildup opposite Taiwan has continued. And if anything, the pace of all those things has increased. And sometimes you hear people argue that China's economic troubles mean that the threat is receding. But I really think that's a dangerous misreading, insofar as history is really full of examples of great powers that became more assertive, not less, as they faced internal pressures. And Xi Jinping has shown every indication of being willing to use external action, even while he's facing internal problems and questions of legitimacy. Now, amidst that growing challenge and those concerns about China's clear capability and intent, the United States has not been standing still. And that's some of the good news here, that there has been bipartisan recognition in Washington of the growing China challenge over the last decade. The 2018 National Defense Strategy during the first Trump administration served as a real inflection point in this regard, where that document formally shifted the defense strategy of the United States away from a primary focus on counterterrorism that had existed since 9/11 toward a strategy much more focused on great power competition as the central challenge, with China as the principal threat. The Biden administration built on this momentum from the first Trump administration, including with the China task force at the Pentagon, which I was privileged to lead at the outset of the administration. And that effort was really about assessing the degree to which the Department of Defense had truly shifted to focusing on the China challenge and what more was needed to make this major transformation, translating from what was a strategic diagnosis to an operational reality. And in practical terms, what did we actually need to do in terms of changing the money we were spending, the weapons we were buying, our forward deployed military in the region, the partnerships with our allies? All of that fed directly into everything that I'm about to describe. But before getting into some of the specifics on the defense policy measures that we moved forward, I did want to spend just a moment on the theory of deterrence as it applies to China, because this is really important. It informs how we think about what we need to do in Asia to keep the peace. And our theory rests on a relatively specific understanding of how Xi Jinping would potentially make the decision to use force. And as I would describe it, we believe that Xi Jinping continues to situate regional security questions, whether it's Taiwan or the South China Sea or vis-a-vis Japan, still in the context of his overall aspirations for China's development. He's not willing to tear it all down and imperil China's future for the sake of absorbing Taiwan. He wants, in the first instance, to win without fighting. And if that doesn't succeed, he wants to be able to invade Taiwan at acceptable cost, which essentially means being able to execute a successful, short, sharp invasion that comes with sufficiently low risk. And the extension of that is that for now, this actually means that there's hope for deterrence and there's hope for the maintenance of peace and stability in the region on an issue like Taiwan, where we can build deterrence around the concept, which you may have heard many times from senior officials, of making sure that Xi Jinping concludes every day that he wakes up that today is not the day. Today is not the day to initiate aggression. Um, we don't need to convince him to give up on unification with Taiwan permanently. We probably can't. But we do need to convince him every single day that the costs and risks of acting today are unacceptably high, that the probability of him being able to achieve a quick or decisive victory is low, that an attempt could result in a protracted, costly, uncertain conflict that could end up threatening the Communist Party's hold on power. So that's the framework of deterrence, and every capability decision, every force posture decision, every alliance decision ends up being measured against that standard. Does this make it harder for Xi Jinping to be able to conclude that kind of a short, sharp war in the way that he would believe would be low cost and successful? So, with that deterrence framework in mind, what does the actual strategy look like? And some of this will get into maybe more technical defense issues than some are familiar with, but I'll try my best to keep it at a relatively understandable level and walk through three pillars. First, the actual military capabilities. Next, what I've been referring to as force posture, which relates to the agreements and the footprint that the U.S. military actually has forward in the Indo-Pacific, whether in Japan, Philippines, Australia, or elsewhere. And then our alliances, our military partnerships with our major friends out in Asia. So, just starting on the capability side, this is relatively straightforward, right? There is an imperative for us to be acquiring more of the things that are more relevant to potential contingencies or crises in the Western Pacific, and we need to acquire them faster. We spent a long time preparing our military to be designed around counterinsurgency, and now it's quite a different effort. That includes investing in submarines, which are a really important platform for Asia. It's obviously a maritime theater and one area where we continue to have a substantial advantage on China's military. We need to more of what is called long-range strike, essentially missiles that would be able to reach long distances that are part of the military theater in the Indo-Pacific and able to hold Chinese naval and air assets at risk. We need to continue advancing our capabilities in space and cyberspace. And there's only so much you can say about this at an unclassified level. But what I will say is that the space and cyber domains are very, very important, and they're likely to be critically important even before the first shot is fired. And that our resilience in that space, and in some respects, our offensive capacity in those domains, will be really essential to everything else working for our military. We also need to be investing in our command and control. This is the ability to communicate and operate our forces across what is a very large theater spanning from the continental United States all the way out to the Western Pacific. And then finally, we need to be focused also on ensuring that our nuclear forces are ready. This is an uncomfortable conversation, but it is a necessary one given China's massive nuclear expansion that is currently underway. We need to maintain our strategic deterrent, including here at home. So that's the really U.S. military capability part, but it isn't just about our capabilities. And one of the critical points I want to leave you with today is that the United States in the long term is not going to be able to deter China by itself. That's not a statement of weakness of the U.S. military. It's more about the strategic math of conducting operations in the Western Pacific. The distances are just too great, and China's inventory is growing too large. So when we talk about capabilities, we need allies and partners doing two things. First, we need them investing in their own self-defense, meaning building their own frontline capabilities that make them harder targets and more resilient. And we need them building capabilities that can contribute to our collective alliances, that we have systems that are what is described in military terms as interoperable, that we can command our forces together, that we can share intelligence, that our logistics networks can work together as well. And increasingly, we are also moving toward a model of more co-production and co-development with our allies and partners, with Australia, with India, with Japan. We're building what could be described as a shared defense industrial base or defense industrial ecosystem that can move faster, that's more innovative and more resilient than any single country can sustain given challenges across supply chains and otherwise. So that's really the first pillar on the capabilities side. The second is on what I described as force posture, how the U.S. military is actually positioned forward in the Indo-Pacific. Our old model and the model that we are revising in the Pacific was having really big, concentrated, major operating bases, primarily in Japan and South Korea. And that made sense for the Cold War. But the problem is now that those bases are quite easily targetable, that China can hold those bases at risk with its huge arsenal of precision missiles. And if your entire posture depends on just a handful of these mega bases, you've essentially created a target set that your adversary can plan against given modern missile technology. So the concept of what we've been putting forward over the last several years, and we made major headway on this during the last administration, was to have a military presence in the Indo-Pacific that has a number of new features, including being more mobile, being able to move around more easily, being more distributed, being spread out more, not so concentrated just in Northeast Asia, being more resilient, being able to operate under more stress, and being more lethal as well. So more smaller footprints in more places, more pre-positioned stock, more expeditionary airfields, meaning airfields that will be able to move around to different locations, and essentially more mobile units that can operate in and out of various areas, including close to China if necessary. The pieces of that have been focused on a number of places, Japan being one of the most important. There really is no credible defense in the Western Pacific without Japan. They're a very important partner, and we've been upgrading and advancing the U.S.-Japan alliance quite significantly over the past several years, upgrading our command structures. Japan has been acquiring new types of defense capabilities, moving away from some of its historical legacy of sort of constrained pacifism. Japan's been spending more on defense in the process of doubling its defense budget, and a whole lot of new operational level integration between U.S. and Japanese forces. And you may have seen the prime minister, a very pro-defense prime minister, pro-national security prime minister, just won re-election on Sunday, and that's going to open the door to a lot more defense cooperation. The Philippines also has been one of the most significant force posture developments of the past 3 years. We have an agreement with the Philippines that we don't have U.S. bases in the Philippines, permanent bases like we do in Japan and South Korea, but we do have an agreement that gives the U.S. military access to now 9 different sites across the Philippines, including in the northern Philippines, which is less than 150 miles from Taiwan. So this isn't permanent basing, but it is about access. It's about the rotation of forces, pre-positioning, and the ability to bring forces forward if necessary in a crisis. The Philippines provides really strategic geography in that regard. Next, I'd highlight Australia, which provides really important strategic depth. Some of you may have heard about the AUKUS initiative, which is a partnership between the United States, the UK, and Australia to build conventionally armed, so not with nuclear weapons, but nuclear-powered submarines, which is a really important generational commitment. And we're working with Australia on a whole set of cooperative efforts all around the country where we have aircraft deployments, we have new logistical hubs that allow us to bring materiel from the United States into Asia, and a lot of joint training at scale in Australia that we haven't had the chance to do before. And Australia provides something really no other ally can, which is significant distance from the Chinese missile threat combined with proximity to some really important sea lanes as it relates to the Indo-Pacific. Finally, just on this question of force posture and the forward deployment of U.S. forces, I would highlight the Pacific Islands, which is a space that the U.S. government neglected for many years, but that has changed. Places like Papua New Guinea, Palau, the Federated States of Micronesia, these are all again strategically significant, and they're key logistical routes between the U.S. homeland and the Western Pacific. We see China aggressively courting these countries, but we, the United States, have been playing catch up with defense cooperation, new embassy openings, Coast Guard deployments, et cetera. The final thing, just related to the strategy that I wanted to highlight, was this idea where our approach to our alliances, where our traditional U.S. alliance architecture in Asia, the nature of our relationships was described for many decades as a hub and spoke model, where the United States was at the center and it had bilateral alliances, meaning just between the United States and one other country, radiating outward like the spokes of a wheel, but very little connectivity among the allies themselves. That model worked well for a long time, but it's increasingly inadequate for the China challenge. And one of the things that we have been doing is trying to build a more networked architecture where our allies and partners are connected to each other and not just to us in a way that would make the whole greater than the sum of the parts. This is the kind of networked architecture that strategists and experts have been aspiring toward for a long time in Washington, but it really started to become a reality over the last 5 years. And there have been many elements to this. The United States, Japan, and South Korea have built up much stronger trilateral cooperation between those three countries. Historically, this has been really hard because of the history between Japan and Korea. But there have been some major summits and new cooperative efforts over the last few years, which have really propelled that cooperative organization forward. We also have what you may have heard as the Quad, the Indo-Pacific Quad, comprising of the United States, Japan, Australia, and India, and a whole set of new cooperative efforts between that foursome of countries. There's the AUKUS arrangement that I referenced earlier. That's an abbreviation of Australia, the UK, and the US, building submarine technology. And there are other configurations, including one that is informally called the Squad, which is the United States, Japan, Australia, and the Philippines. But what I'll say is there is a bigger aspiration here, at least my aspiration, and something I've written about, which would be something like the formation of a Pacific Defense Pact, which we have NATO in Europe, but we don't have any kind of a collective security arrangement in Asia. And my personal view is that although we've made a lot of progress on linking our allies together, as I've described, the current arrangements are important, but they're just too ad hoc and they're too informal. And they're not providing the kind of real combat credible deterrence that's going to be necessary to keep the peace in the Indo-Pacific. And I think we do need a more structured, more committed network of security partnerships with sharing planning and intelligence and capabilities and otherwise. And I had an essay about this in Foreign Affairs last year, if folks are interested. But we've moved from aspiration toward reality over the past several years in terms of starting to link these alliances together. And I think the question is now, does that trajectory continue into something more formalized in the years ahead? Which brings me to the third part of my remarks here, which is to answer the question of sort of where are we now? What does the present look like? What is the Trump administration doing on some of these issues? And I'll offer a little bit of critique here, but happy to get into more discussion on this when we get into questions and conversation. And maybe I'll just start with the Trump administration's China policy, because that obviously sets the tone for how one thinks about defense strategy in the Indo-Pacific, where interestingly, I think if you look at the first year of this administration, China as a strategic priority is actually getting a lot less attention than it did during Trump's first term, when it was a very top priority. If you'll remember during the first term, um, whatever its other issues, the Trump administration did produce a national security strategy, a national defense strategy that I described earlier, that were really clear-eyed about the China challenge and the personnel that they had at the Defense Department, at the White House, at the State Department, were very focused on China and had real influence inside the administration. This time around, with the second Trump administration, we haven't seen a lot of focus on China in the national security strategy or the national defense strategy. The language on China from the administration has not been particularly clear, and the administration's strategic bandwidth is clearly consumed by a whole set of other priorities, whether it's Venezuela and the Panama Canal, or Greenland and Ukraine, or Gaza, or the Houthis in Yemen, or Iran. It has been the case again and again that there's just been a lot less attention on what's happening in the Indo-Pacific. I think China is on the list, but it's clearly not anywhere near the top. So it's overall just a lower priority. Um, it's also the case, interestingly, that heretofore, um, the second Trump administration has been taking a much more accommodating posture toward China. And a lot of this is related to President Trump and his upcoming visit to Beijing in April. We've seen the administration in an effort to um, develop warmer relations with Beijing and ensure the president has a really positive trip in April. The administration has been rolling back a number of competitive actions toward China on things like export controls around sensitive technologies. We've seen the administration reducing support to Taiwan, halting investigations and sanctions related to Chinese cyber espionage. The list goes sort of on and on. But the bottom line is that the overall thrust of the policy has moved from one focused much more on competition, to particularly compared to Trump's first term, to one that is much more accommodating. Now, you may argue this is just transactional, that the administration is looking for Chinese concessions on trade or fentanyl or other issues in exchange for this easing of strategic pressure from the United States. That may be the case. Um, but the problem with that theory is that China itself is offering really minor tactical and superficial concessions in response and really not addressing any of the fundamental tensions at the root of our troubled economic relationship with the PRC. And in exchange, it appears that the Trump administration may be ready to hand off things that actually are quite important for our alliances and for some of our technological advantages. And Beijing understands that well. And in the lead up to the president's trip in April, there's a lot of maneuvering going on now around what any agreements might look like in that regard. As it relates to so let me just turn from China briefly to talk a little bit about what's happening with our allies and partners right now, including as it relates to the defense strategy that I described earlier. I think what I would say here, actually, interestingly, is that we're seeing what is a bit of a split screen where the reality is maybe more complex than some of the headlines suggest. At the operational level, at the actual level of military to military cooperation, exercises, rotational deployments. We actually have not seen dramatic changes yet. The machinery of our military cooperation and our alliance cooperation has maintained significant momentum. And I was actually just out in Hawaii for a major defense conference a few weeks ago. That's where Indo-Pacific Command is, that commands all of our forces in the Western Pacific. There were a number of allied defense leaders there. And honestly, you wouldn't have known anything had changed over the last 12 months if you were listening to these military leaders talking about their various initiatives and priorities. Our military exercises with our allies are bigger than ever. More and more partners are joining these exercises, and more capabilities are being brought to bear than ever. So at the operational level, um, things are moving forward as well as ever. But of course, at the political and diplomatic level, the picture is more troubling. And the combination of the administration's tariffs against some of our closest allies, some even at quite high levels that rival and in some instances surpass the levels of the tariffs on China, um, repeated questions about the commitment, the credibility of U.S. security commitments around the world. These are all generating a lot of uncertainty among our allies. And in the alliance context, that uncertainty can be quite poisonous or counterproductive. And maybe I'll just give you, to kind of unpack this in a little more detail, give you a sense of three of the scenarios that I'm going to be watching for. Um, the first would be, do we see our allies and partners starting to lean more toward China? I mean, clearly we saw the Canadian Prime Minister, the British Prime Minister travel to Beijing over the last several weeks, seeking to stabilize and deepen their relationships with China. And that's partially a response to the perception that the United States is a less reliable partner than it used to be. It's also partly a response to the United States itself cozying up more to Beijing. But if you're one of these countries, if you're an ally country and your main ally, the United States, is seen as unpredictable, if your main ally is hitting you with tariffs that are undermining your economy, then hedging toward the other great power becomes more attractive, even if strategically it's a dangerous thing to do. So we ought to be looking out for, do we see our allies starting to tilt toward China in a much more significant way? Second, related, but slightly different, to what degree are we seeing our countries diversifying away from their historic relationships with the United States without necessarily tilting toward China, but a little bit tilting away from the United States still? And we've seen a number of examples on this. We saw India sign a major trade deal recently with the European Union. And again, there is some logic to this. If the United States is going to be a less reliable partner, if China is still seen as a threat or a country that you're not ready to work with more closely, the logical response, obviously, is to build alternative partnerships. That's a rational thing to do. In many instances, from the U.S. perspective, it's not entirely unwelcome. But if done in certain ways, it can certainly fragment the coalitions we've been trying to build in the China context. So that's another question to watch when you see in the paper a big new agreement or new defense engagements between a country in Asia and another country in Asia, or a country in Asia and a country in Europe. To what degree is that hedging against the United States? And then third and finally, maybe a little bit more subtle, but do we see these countries in general just doing less? Are they reducing their ambitions? Um, do the hard things that we've been doing lose political momentum because allied governments conclude that the United States isn't committed enough to justify the domestic political costs of these initiatives? Because a lot of the stuff we do domestic that we do in the military and defense space, it is not overtly, but it is obviously designed toward deterrence in the China context. Beijing doesn't like that. And there are economic and political and diplomatic costs for these countries for partnering with the United States. So are they willing to continue to do that? Or do we see a little bit of a diminution of the big strategic initiatives in our alliances. So those are just some things to watch. I think the real answer is at this stage, we don't know yet how much damage will be done to our alliances on this current trajectory. The institutional foundations of our approach, I think, are shared and strong. Our alliances have certainly survived rocky periods before. And the China challenge hasn't gone away and isn't going away. And in fact, has its own gravitational pull that tends to keep the United States and its allies working together, regardless of the political and diplomatic disruptions. But what I will say is that I do think we are spending down a strategic account that took years to build. The kinds of things we're doing around bringing our partners together, the kinds of agreements we've signed to have U.S. military presence in the region, the kind of trust that's required to do some of the major co-development and industrial cooperation that we've done. These are not things that you can break and then easily reassemble. And every month that we have of strategic drift or mixed signals or allied uncertainty, all of that makes the deterrence equation less favorable. So maybe then I'll just close with a thought, which is that the Indo-Pacific strategy that we're talking about here, that we've been building, from my perspective, is one of the most important things that the United States has done in defense policy since the end of the Cold War. It's been largely bipartisan. It's been grounded in a realistic assessment of the threat. And by and large, it's been working, not perfectly, not completely, but the trajectory has been right in terms of stabilizing the Indo-Pacific, where we haven't seen the kind of instability and conflict that we've seen in almost every other part of the world. Um, on top of that, the China challenge, as I mentioned, has not changed. Xi Jinping's ambitions have not moderated. The military balance is not getting any easier. And if anything, it's getting more urgent as China's increasing capabilities and its potential window for aggression move closer. So I think the question we have now is not whether we have the strategy right. I think the bipartisan consensus on that is pretty clear. But I think the question now is whether we'll sustain it. And that's not just a question of policy, but even one more of politics, of political will, of strategic seriousness, and really ultimately whether the United States is prepared to do what it needs to do to rise to the China challenge. And happy to get into all the different elements of this in the discussion today. So again, thank you all for being here. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to the discussion.
Got it.
Yes.
Thank you. Dr. Ratner. Excuse me. Wow. Okay. You've given us an awful lot of things to think about and probably about a million questions that immediately come to mind. So let's start. I'd really like to hear some questions from our students. But where do we start?
Looks like you go.
Okay, over here, Penn State, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, I'll hold the mic. If you tell us your name and your question.
My name is Valor, and my question is, since the U.S. has a lot of alliances, AUKUS, the NATO partners, and Quad all around China, what military alliances China have to counteract all these alliances that the U.S. have?
So that's a great question because I think it underscores the degree to which U.S. alliance and partnerships really are one of our major strategic advantages, not just in the military domain, but around the world, insofar as China does not have any formal alliances at all. They have an agreement with North Korea that some interpret as an alliance. Oh, sorry, just getting some feedback there. Um, So okay, can you hear me okay?
No, the problem, I was joining to watch the chat and I created a feedback loop. Sorry.
Tell them what's going on, David.
Mike, should I
Should I
change this mic?
sorry, can I go
Yeah.
ahead? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you should be good now.
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. Very direct answer to the question. China does not have security partners like the United States with formal treaties, mutual security treaties, whereby if China were to get into a conflict, it would expect another military to fight with it in the way that the United States has in all sorts of coalitions over the last several decades. And that's a real advantage for the United States. That China does have a bit of an on paper agreement with North Korea, but they certainly don't train and exercise in a way that would allow them to fight together. That said, I will just make one other point, which is that China's relationship with Russia has obviously been growing much closer over the last decade in particular, and China has been one of the key players actually in the Ukraine conflict, not by the Chinese military participating directly, but by sustaining Russia's defense industrial base and giving it the ability to continue fighting day after day and month after month. And I think there's some expectation that if China were to get into a similar circumstance, that we may not see the Russian military actually fighting alongside China's military, but that in the event of a conflict, Russia may certainly be assisting China with key supplies, with energy, and other forms of support. So we haven't yet seen China form formal alliances. I think it's still probably a ways from wanting to do that, but and that's a huge advantage for the United States, and it's one of the reasons why, even as the Trump administration, I think is trying to rebalance some of our alliances and make them more reciprocal and more equitable. It's also really important that they do that in a way that doesn't do so much damage to those alliances that we lose this really important asset that we have now in the competition.
Hold on a moment, please. I'll get back there. I'm going to take the opportunity to ask a question myself. Is there any kind of a timeline that she has for advancing China's move to become more aggressive?
Well, that is a really great question. I'm glad you asked it because very often at every turn, when you read about this issue and when you hear about this issue, you often hear the date 2027. And the reason why you hear that is because, as was disclosed by the CIA director in open testimony, um, Bill Burns during the Biden administration, um, we know that Xi Jinping has directed his military to be ready, from their perspective, um, to be able to both invade Taiwan and repel the United States from coming and other partners from coming to Taiwan's defense. Now, there's a really important distinction here, which is that is a capability target. It is not a intent to go by a certain date. So he set that military modernization goal of 2027. But as I mentioned earlier, just to put it another way, I think we continue to believe that uh, his calculation around using force continues to be conditions based, that he's unlikely to do it unless he believes that it can be done successfully at acceptable cost. So I think this is, from my perspective, maybe somewhere this is a place where China and Russia differ, where Russia and Vladimir Putin have clearly been willing to do sort of catastrophic damage to Russia's economy and standing in the world and military for the sake of the war in Ukraine. I don't think if Xi Jinping looked over to what's happening in Ukraine, he would say to himself, that looks like an attractive thing to be doing, because again, he's got broader aspirations um, for China's rise. It's also the case that, as I mentioned very briefly in passing, that on a number of these issues, Xi Jinping is aiming to what is described as win without fighting, to be using a combination of economic pressure and political pressure and military pressure and influence to try to resolve these issues in its favor without having to use the military tool. And I think we see that in part in the way that Xi is approaching President Trump and what he's trying to extract out of President Trump through their high-level meetings this year. And then there's the domestic politics in Taiwan itself, where you have it's a multi-party democracy, but you have two major parties that tend to differ in terms of their desire to maintain the status quo and be a self-governing island, not independence, but a self-governing island, versus the current opposition, which would be potentially more interested in a closer relationship with Beijing, maybe all the way to evolving something like the one country, two systems construct that we saw with Hong Kong for quite some time. So the upshot of that is that if you're Xi Jinping, you are going to try every which way you can to modernize your military to be ready, but also to use all of these other mechanisms below the threshold of actual conflict to try to achieve the outcome you're achieving. And I think in that score, he has reason to believe that he may be able to succeed in doing that because of domestic politics in the United States and domestic politics in Taiwan, which again somewhat reduce the urgency of having to resolve the military issue right now. So I think there is I've been on the record saying this. I testified before Congress when I was working in government and said frequently that we believed that an invasion of Taiwan was neither imminent nor inevitable. I think those are really important descriptors. I think that's still the case if we exact a very focused strategy. So for now, I think maybe we have a little bit of time, but not a lot of time. And then just the other part of this deterrence equation that I think is worth mentioning is what you may have seen over the last couple of weeks, which is Xi Jinping has essentially purged his entire senior military, that there is something called the Central Military Commission, a group of what had been 7 military leaders. Historically, it had even been bigger, that Xi Jinping himself chairs, but very senior military leaders who make decisions around the Liberation Army, the PLA, that's China's military, around its activities and its modernization. What Xi Jinping has done over the last few years is systematically purge and arrest every one of these people except one on this commission, and hasn't replaced them yet. So it would be as if, here in the United States, we took out all of the Joint Chiefs and hadn't put anyone in place. It's not really the place you want to be in to get involved in major operations. So again, I think all those signals point toward this not being a very near-term thing. I think if I woke up tomorrow and there were headlines that China had invaded Taiwan, I would be really, really surprised. But the potential for that in the future is very real, even in the next few years. And in the meantime, China is going to do what we've been seeing it do, which is exacting a huge amount of pressure across the board on Taiwan, but other countries in the region to try to compel them to act to China's will. So it's not a very positive trajectory by any means. And just on the last thing I'll say on the military front is I do think if the United States, through its own activities and then in cooperation with a set of allies, I think it is possible to deter and prevent major Chinese aggression well out into the future. So I do think there's hope for that, but it requires really focused and resource decision making.
Very much.
Thanks, Dave. Glass half empty question. Let's say we all wake up January 1st, 2027, and China does invade Taiwan. What's the war games kind of play by play that you would anticipate?
Oh, that's true.
So it's another really good question. And without getting into sort of uh, obviously sort of classified outcomes of actual wargaming, what I will say is if you had asked that question 4 or 5 years ago, I think the response would have been pretty negative. And you've had former US officials coming out publicly and saying, hey, in the war games we've had with China over Taiwan, they've gone pretty badly. Uh, and the recognition of that and this overall refocusing on the China challenge for the Defense Department has led to a series of changes over the last 5 years that I think has changed the sort of bottom line to that question, where we have been revising what is called the operational concepts of the U.S. military, so the way the U.S. military is actually going to fight. We've been revising the capabilities, as I was describing earlier. We've been changing our force posture, as I described earlier, in the Western Pacific in a way that is less advantageous to China's military strategy. And we've been drawing more and more allies into the region to potentially participate. And so, if you had asked that question 5 years ago, the answer would have been like, its prospects are bad and they're getting worse. I think because of the steps that we've taken over the last 5 years, the answer would be um, it would be a horrible event, and we ought to do everything we can to prevent it. And that's why we ought to be investing first and foremost in deterrence. But the actual outcome of the conflict, I think, is less predetermined than it would have been 5 years ago, and it's a much more mixed picture because of the ways in which, again, we would be fighting differently, the role of U.S. submarines, the capabilities we have to strike Chinese assets. And what's new and growing very fast is the role of autonomy and unmanned systems, which changes the equation as well, because you can amass a lot of military power in a way that costs a lot less than big, expensive, exquisite U.S. military systems. So that altogether is presenting a scenario where uh, Chinese victory is by no means predetermined. I think it's actually getting less likely. And that's why, from a deterrence perspective, that's a good thing in terms of Xi Jinping's calculation. The other thing that I would say, and I would expect there are veterans and military professionals in the room who could explain this even better than I can, but I would say it is also the case that um, the invasion of Taiwan is not an easy military operation. The Chinese military would obviously have to cross the Taiwan Strait, which is a very difficult operation. The Navy and the Air Force would be very exposed as they came across. And then Taiwan itself is not favorable territory for an invader. It's very mountainous. For those of you who maybe haven't been there, there are only a few ports of entry. Once you get on, the roadways and whatnot are very congested. So from a defense perspective, it isn't just about stopping the Chinese military from coming across the Taiwan Strait. It's also about if the Chinese military even were to gain some kind of a foothold on the island of Taiwan, the defense of the island would become an important part of that, that would also favor the defender. And given that, one of the things that has really changed over the last few years, I should have mentioned this in sort of the litany of elements of deterrence, is that Taiwan's military itself has been growing stronger and has been modernizing in a way that is very specifically oriented to an important role of defending the island and stopping the near an invasion of China's military. It's not going to be strong enough to do that all on its own, but to the extent that it can itself slow and degrade China's military, that's yet another factor that Xi Jinping has to think about. So it's an awful scenario from the perspective of lives, from a perspective of the military consequences. The economic consequences globally are almost unthinkable. But the actual military operational elements of it, I think we've gone from a scenario where it was really looking quite negative in terms of the trajectory to leveling off to potentially even looking better and sustainable over time.
Here, but just to say again, we want to hear from the students.
Good afternoon. My name is Matt, and I saw that in 2018 you co-authored an article in Foreign Affairs titled "The China Reckoning: How Beijing Defied American Expectations." Could you tell us what were those American expectations?
No, it's a great point, and for folks interested in this issue, would encourage you to read that piece. I co-authored it with a guy named Kurt Campbell, who was at the White House during the Biden administration running Asia policy, and then went on to be the Deputy Secretary of State toward the end of the administration. One of the absolute leading thinkers on Asia strategy in the United States. So that article was written at a very particular point in time. I mentioned in my talk that there had been this shift from counterterrorism to be more focused on great power competition and the China challenge. We wrote that article as maybe one of the first clarion calls, really trying to set urgency around having a more honest conversation about U.S.-China policy. Because at the end of the Cold War, and all the way through really most of the 2010s or halfway through the 2010s, the United States had a relatively consistent China policy, which was largely based on a theory of integration that essentially, if we engaged China diplomatically, if we integrated China's economy into our economy, we got closer to it, if we integrated China into all of the international institutions, that it would essentially change China for the better, that China's politics would start to open up a little bit, not that they were going to become a Jeffersonian democracy, but the politics may become more open, that economically it might become more market-based, and that from a foreign policy perspective, it would be obviously growing in power, but not be as revisionist a power where it was thinking about overturning a number of the sort of rules of the road out in the region and globally. And what I saw personally, and I started writing about this really in the early 2000s when I was doing my PhD, was that it was clear to me that that integration story was not playing out. And I had the opportunity to live in China for a couple years while I was doing my graduate studies, traveled all around the country, went out to Xinjiang, which is in Western China, which is the Western province where the genocide against the Muslims ended up taking place, but already saw a real deepening of authoritarianism there. They had cameras up on every corner. They were bulldozing the old traditional city where the Muslims lived. They were shuttering the mosques. And it was clear just kind of the power of the police state at the time. So the politics have gotten much more authoritarian under Xi Jinping. The economics, rather than opening, Xi Jinping has even doubled down on a state-led economy, a much more internal, autarkic economy. And from a foreign policy perspective, we have seen much more assertiveness globally and in Asia as well. So we had, I think, a aspiration that integration was going to occur, and that we were going to be able to manage the rise of China in a way where everybody wins. There's no risk, there's no cost, there's no sacrifice. And over time, throughout the 2010s, and particularly when Xi Jinping came into power in 2012, after that period, the delta between the reality and the aspiration just became too big to ignore. But paradigms and consensus are very powerful things. There's a lot of stakeholders in America who are still committed, even to this day, to that vision and that aspiration. And they argue that competition with China is misguided, and they have their own reasons for making that argument. But I think from an analytical perspective, we needed to shift from that more integration policy to a policy of competition, and sort of existent with that is the fact that the US government in its entirety, whether you're talking about the Defense Department, the White House, the State Department, elsewhere, had spent decades focused on Europe and focused really on the Middle East, Iraq and Afghanistan, and all but ignoring the China challenge as it was mounting and mounting and mounting and mounting. So, as America often does, we waited a little late to refocus on this one. I'm not sure we have to the degree that we need to, but at least there was that paradigm shift away from this more rosy belief in this integration story that was going to be, we get everything we want, and can't we all get along here? Um, I will say one last thing, which is I think there was a lot of, when that article was written and the series of actions that followed, there were several years in Washington in which there was a newer bipartisan consensus around this notion of great power competition and the need to deal more forthrightly with China. I think what we've seen over the last couple of years is that that consensus has actually frayed a little bit, and that there are parts of both political parties, whether it's because they're more isolationist or they're less interested in the United States playing as active a role in international politics, that are starting to question whether do we really need these alliances? Who really cares what's happening out in Asia? Why do we have such a confrontational relationship with China? And I think we'll see, frankly, in the next presidential election, I think we'll see candidates on both sides of the aisle that are putting forward arguments around a more cooperative relationship with China that has a flavor of that set of arguments that prevailed in the 1990s and the 2000s. So we may have to have this debate all over again. But the article was written at sort of the end of the previous period and the beginning of this new period of competition.
Hi, my name is Alicia Miller. We are from the Muhlenberg Junior High School over here. I actually have a student question, but I have been nominated to ask. So you mentioned that China's kind of slowly slipping down the priority list. And the question is, if there's one thing that we should be paying attention to coming from China, what would that be?
So, well, there's a lot. Maybe I'll say that the things that are concerning to me, or maybe the policy positions that are a little bit up for grabs right now that I think are most important. Maybe I'll just name two. The first would be, it's a little bit technical, but the ramifications are absolutely strategic and global. The question of U.S. export controls on advanced semiconductor technology. So during the Biden administration, building on good work during the Trump administration, we put in new controls to prevent export to China of the most advanced semiconductor capabilities. And then we worked with our allies to ensure that nobody was shipping what's called semiconductor manufacturing equipment to China either. So to prevent China's ability to both buy or build the most advanced semiconductors. This is something that's really hard. They've been trying to catch up on, but they haven't been able to do. And the reason this matters so much is because the ability to possess large quantities of these advanced semiconductors is, from a US-China perspective, probably the single most important variable in the competition between the United States and China on artificial intelligence, where China needs those advanced semiconductors to be able to do the type and level of computing that it needs to be able to do at scale to advance its AI models and to be able to incorporate those AI models into all aspects of its military, which it's doing, whether it's related to testing its nuclear weapons or building cyber espionage or space capabilities. Whoever owns this space is going to have a massive military capability. And right now, because of the export controls that have put in place, China has been unable to advance its AI technologies as fast as it could in the military domain and in the security domain and the espionage domain. So maintaining our lead in that space is of utmost importance from a national security perspective, in our ability to control the export of semiconductors is part of it. So you may have seen articles and debates around whether or not companies like NVIDIA should be able to sell semiconductors to China. There's a business interest from NVIDIA to do so. But from a national security perspective, at least in the circles that I live in, it's really dangerous. And there's questions right now around where is the Trump administration going to draw the line in terms of what level of semiconductors and in what quantity are permissible for export to China. So the export controls around the semiconductors would be absolutely number one. And then, or one of the top ones. And then I think the other one would be ensuring that the United States, per the earlier question around alliances, sustains its commitment to its allies in the region. And this isn't just a treaty living on paper, and it's not just in the instance of a big war. It's really every day under the pressure and military coercion from the PLA. Is the United States out there diplomatically, politically, and from a military operational perspective, supporting and backing up our allies as the PLA and China's Coast Guard and military and others are doing things like air incursions into the sovereignty of other countries. And there, I would say there's been some slippage from the Trump administration, or at least mixed signals. So I think the key question is, are we providing and continuing to provide security assistance to countries like, or to partners like Taiwan? Are we building our alliances further and stronger with the Philippines and with Australia, and with Japan too? That's been under a lot of pressure recently, given the more nationalist stance of the new prime minister in Japan. China has really been trying to undermine her. And the United States, frankly, hasn't been as supportive of her as it should be. And in the same instance, is tilting toward Beijing rather than tilting toward our allies. So I think those things are all in play. I think there's a real chance that the Trump administration will sort of tilt back in the right direction, be there for our allies, hold firm on the export controls. But as we look toward Trump's trip to Beijing in April, I think those are the two things to watch. What happens on technology export controls, and does the Trump administration signal on things like Taiwan or the military relationships in the region that it's going to be more accommodating to China in a way that undermines the security of our partners? That's what I put at the top of the list.
Okay, Dr. Ratner, thank you. I think we've run out of time. Lots more questions. Next girl. That's fantastic. That's a great note to finish on. Give us two things there to look forward to in the not too distant future. Yes. Dr. Ratner, thank you very much. Warren, back to you.
Thank you. All right. Thank you again to Dr. Ratner, and we will be sending a thank you gift to him for giving us his wonderful presentation today.